My boyfriend insisted his female roommate was like a sister. Until the lease renewal listed them as married, there's a specific sentence that used to make me feel embarrassed for even needing to ask. "She's basically my sister, Claire. You have nothing to worry about." Adam said some version of that sentence to me probably a dozen times over the 2 years we dated, always in the same calm, faintly amused tone, the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a person who should really know better than to ask. I believed him. Or more accurately, I talked myself into believing him over and over for 2 years, right up until the afternoon I found a piece of paper on his kitchen counter that used one very specific word to describe his relationship with that sister. And the word wasn't sister at all. It was spouse. My name is Claire. I met Adam through a mutual friends game night, 29 years old at the time, funny, easygoing, the kind of guy who made everyone in a room feel like the most interesting person in it. 3 months into dating, he told me, casually over dinner, about his living situation, that he shared a 2-bedroom apartment with a woman named Vivian, someone he'd known since college, that they'd been roommates for almost 6 years at that point, that people sometimes assumed there was something romantic going on between them, but that it genuinely wasn't like that she was basically family to him, closer than most of his actual siblings. I want to be honest and say I didn't love that arrangement from the very beginning, but I also didn't think it was fair or reasonable of me to demand he uproot a 6-year living situation over an assumption I had no real evidence for. Plenty of people have opposite-sex roommates without anything romantic happening. I told myself that constantly during the early months of our relationship, every time some small detail made me pause a little longer than it probably should have. Adam was, in almost every other respect, exactly the kind of partner I'd always hoped to find. He remembered small details from conversations weeks later, showed up reliably, made me laugh on hard days without ever making light of what I was actually going through. It's part of why the whole situation with Vivian felt so difficult to fully interrogate for so long, because everything else about the relationship felt so solid that questioning the one piece that didn't quite fit felt like it risked unraveling something genuinely good over what might, for all I actually knew at the time, be nothing more than my own insecurity talking. The first time I actually met Vivian, about 4 months into dating Adam, she was polite to me in a way that felt, even then, slightly performative, warm on the surface, but with something colder and more assessing underneath it, the way you might size up a competitor rather than welcome a new person into your friend's life. She asked me pointed questions about my job, my family, how serious things were with Adam, in a way that felt less like genuine curiosity and more like information gathering. Adam didn't seem to notice any of this, or if he did, he never mentioned it, always steering the conversation back toward something lighter whenever it threatened to get uncomfortable. I remember driving home from that first dinner and turning it over in my head, unable to quite name what had bothered me so much about the evening, and eventually landing on a small, specific detail that stuck with me for weeks afterward. At one point, reaching for the salt across the table, Vivian's hand had brushed against Adam's, and instead of the brief, unremarkable contact you'd expect between platonic roommates, both of them had paused, just slightly, in a way that felt oddly charged, before continuing the conversation as if nothing had happened. I told myself I was reading too much into half a second of accidental contact. I've thought about that half second many times since. Over the following year and a half, I collected a slow accumulation of small, individually explainable oddities about their dynamic that, much like a lot of stories like mine, only really made sense once I finally saw the full picture laid out together. Adam and Vivian split every single household bill down to the dollar, tracked in a shared app, which on its own is just responsible roommate behavior, except that the app also tracked things like date night budget and anniversary gift fund, categories that struck me when I first noticed them scrolling past on his phone as strange things for platonic roommates to be splitting costs on. They celebrated the anniversary of the day they moved in together every single year, a tradition Adam described to me as just a fun roommate thing, complete with a nice dinner out, just the two of them, an outing I was never once invited to join in 2 years of dating him. Vivian's family, When I met them briefly at a barbecue Adam brought me to, treated him with a warmth and familiarity that felt entirely disproportionate to a simple roommate relationship. Vivian's mother hugged him for what felt like an unusually long time, called him sweetheart, in a way she didn't extend to any of Vivian's other friends there, and at one point, referring to some family photo album out on the table, pointed to a photo and said, to another relative, not realizing I was standing close enough to hear, "That's from Vivi and Adam's big day, remember?" Adam, when I asked him about it in the car afterward, laughed it off, said her mom got confused sometimes, was probably talking about some unrelated event, a graduation party maybe, and I let it go, the way I'd let a dozen other small oddities go over those 2 years, because confronting each one individually always felt disproportionate, like I was building a case out of nothing more than vibes and my own insecurity. I talked to my best friend Holly about it more than once during that stretch, laying out the accumulating list of small, strange details, and Holly, to her credit, never fully dismissed my concerns, but she also didn't push too hard toward any dramatic conclusion. "Some people just have weird, close friendships," she told me. "It doesn't automatically mean something's going on, but you know your gut better than I do." The engagement happened a little over a year into our relationship, a proposal I'd genuinely been thrilled about at the time, on a weekend trip to the coast, ring and everything. A moment that, looking back now, I still don't fully know how to feel about, because it happened while an entire other layer of Adam's life was apparently still sitting completely hidden from me. We started slowly, talking about moving in together, which meant, among other logistics, figuring out what would happen with Adam's current apartment, the one he still shared with Vivian. I remember those planning conversations with a strange, retrospective discomfort now, because I brought up, more than once, the practical question of when exactly Adam planned to move out of the apartment he shared with Vivian, and each time, he'd give some version of the same vague answer, that they were still working out the logistics, that it wasn't fair to leave her scrambling to find a new roommate on short notice, that 6 years of friendship deserved a reasonable transition period. At the time, those answers struck me as thoughtful, even admirable, evidence of a man who took his commitments to the people in his life seriously. Knowing what I know now, I understand them as something closer to stalling, a series of soft, reasonable-sounding delays from a man who had far more invested in that living situation than he'd ever let on. That's how I ended up at their apartment on a Saturday afternoon about 4 months after the engagement, waiting for Adam to finish a work call before we headed out to look at a place together, sitting alone at the kitchen counter where he'd left a small stack of mail and paperwork from a document he'd apparently been filling out that morning, the annual lease renewal for the apartment. I wasn't snooping, not really, not at first. Was just sitting there in plain view, and I glanced at it the way you glance at anything left open on a counter while you're waiting for someone. The form had a section near the top for tenant information, primary tenant, Adam's full name, and beneath it, a second line for any additional occupant, with a small drop-down style field indicating their relationship to the primary tenant. I remember reading that field twice, certain I'd misread it the first time. The word printed there wasn't roommate. It wasn't friend, it was spouse. I sat there for what felt like a very long time, staring at that single word, feeling the entire architecture of the past 2 years quietly rearrange itself in my head. I picked up the paper, hands not quite steady, and kept reading. The building, it turned out, had a specific, long-standing tenant benefit for that particular unit. A legacy rent stabilization clause tied to a previous tenant decades earlier. One that allowed the unit to be passed down or maintained at a below-market rate, specifically for a married couple. A benefit that had apparently been quietly maintained, year after year, by Adam and Vivian renewing that lease under exactly the designation now sitting in front of me. When Adam walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, phone call finished, I didn't say anything right away. I just turned the paper around and slid it toward him across the counter, watching his face as he registered what I was looking at. He didn't deny it immediately, which somehow made it worse than if he had. He sat down across from me, slowly, and started explaining, in the careful, measured tone of someone who'd clearly rehearsed some version of this explanation in his head at some point. just in case, without ever actually planning to volunteer it. He and Vivian had gotten married at 23. He told me, a courthouse ceremony, mostly for practical reasons, health insurance, specifically, when Vivian had gone through a serious medical scare in her early 20s and lost coverage through her parents' plan right when she needed it most. And marrying Adam, who had solid employer coverage at the time, had solved the problem cleanly and quickly. They'd always meant to get divorced eventually, he said, once it stopped mattering practically, but the years had just kept passing, and somewhere in there, the marriage had become useful again, this time for the apartment's rent stabilization benefit, and neither of them had ever quite gotten around to undoing it. "It's just paperwork," he said, and I remember that phrase landing on me with a specific, sickening familiarity, because it was almost word for word what he'd told me about Vivian's mother's comment at the barbecue, about the shared anniversary dinners, about a dozen small moments I'd let slide over 2 years because each individual explanation had sounded reasonable enough in isolation. "It's not real, Claire. We're not together like that. I promise you, nothing's ever happened between us since we were kids, basically. I want to be honest about what made this so much harder to sit with than a straightforward affair might have been, strange as that sounds. If Adam had simply cheated on me with someone, I think the shape of my anger would have been simpler, more familiar, something I'd seen play out in other people's stories 100 times before. What I was actually dealing with was something stranger, and, in its own way, more corrosive. A man who had spent 2 years insisting a legal, ongoing marriage was nothing more than an innocent living arrangement, who had let me build an entire future with him, an engagement, apartment hunting, wedding planning conversations, while still legally bound to someone else the entire time. Someone he apparently trusted enough to maintain that arrangement with, but hadn't trusted me enough to simply tell the truth about. I didn't confront Vivian that day. I left the apartment instead, telling Adam I needed space to think, and drove straight to Holly's place, where I sat on her couch and cried in the specific, disoriented way you cry when you're not entirely sure yet whether you're grieving a relationship or the version of reality you thought you'd been living in. Over the following week, I did something I probably should have thought to do much earlier in the relationship, given how many small red flags I'd been quietly collecting for 2 years. I pulled the marriage record myself, a public document, available through the county clerk's office with minimal effort, and confirmed what Adam had told me, that he and Vivian had indeed married 6 years earlier. What I also found, and what Adam either genuinely hadn't realized or had conveniently left out of his kitchen counter explanation, was that no divorce filing existed anywhere in the county system, not initiated, not pending, nothing. In 6 years, despite Adam's insistence that they'd always meant to get around to it eventually, neither of them had ever taken a single concrete step toward actually ending the marriage. I spent an evening that week going back through old photos on my phone, an impulse I didn't fully understand until I was already doing it, looking for anything I might have missed, any small detail hiding in plain sight the way the lease paperwork had been sitting right there on the counter the whole time. I found a photo from the barbecue, the one where Vivian's mother had made that offhand comment about the big day, and zoomed in on Adam's hand in the background of the shot. And there it was, faint but unmistakable once I knew to look for it. A thin gold band on his ring finger that I'd apparently registered at some point without ever consciously processing what I was seeing. Some part of my brain filing it away as unremarkable, maybe a class ring, maybe nothing at all. Because the alternative had simply been too large to consider without more evidence than a single blurry photo could provide. I also discovered, digging a little further with Holly's help one evening over a bottle of wine and a laptop, that Adam and Vivian had been filing their taxes jointly, as a married couple, for the past 3 years, a detail that added a financial dimension to the whole situation that went well beyond just paperwork for an old insurance problem. Married filing jointly comes with real, tangible tax advantages, and Adam had apparently been quietly benefiting from those advantages, year after year, while telling me his relationship with Vivian was purely platonic. I confronted him with all of it about 10 days after the initial lease discovery, this time not alone at their apartment, but at a neutral coffee shop, Evidence printed and organized in a folder I set on the table between us. The marriage record, the absence of any divorce filing, the joint tax filings I'd found reference to through a shared financial planning email Adam had, embarrassingly for him, once CC'd me on by mistake almost a year earlier without either of us thinking anything of it at the time. "You've been telling me for 2 years this was nothing," I said. "Not romantic, not real, just old paperwork you never got around to cleaning up. But you've been actively renewing it every single year and benefiting from it financially, and I don't understand how any of that squares with 'she's basically my sister.'" He didn't have a clean answer. He tried for a while to argue that the financial benefits were incidental, that the marriage itself really was purely practical, no romantic component at all. But somewhere in the middle of that explanation, he admitted something that finally made the whole picture click into place for me. He and Vivian had discussed, more than once over the years, actually filing for divorce, and each time Vivian had been the one to push back, citing the apartment, the insurance, the taxes, practical reasons that always seemed to outweigh whatever urgency existed to formalize the end of a marriage that, by his own account, hadn't meant anything for years. Adam had simply never pushed hard enough to override her reluctance, not when we started dating, not when we got engaged, not even after he must have known, on some level, that continuing to describe Vivian as basically a sister was becoming a lie of omission every single day he let it continue. "Did it ever occur to you," I asked him, "that maybe I deserved to know I was engaged to a married man? Not eventually. Not once you got around to explaining it. Before I said yes." He was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally did, his voice had lost some of the careful, rehearsed quality from earlier in the conversation. "I think I was scared that if I told you, you'd leave. And I think some part of me knew that fear itself was the problem, that if I actually believed this was nothing, I wouldn't have been so scared to just say it out loud." It was, I'll admit, the most honest thing he said to me during that entire conversation, and also, in its own way, the most damning, because it confirmed that he'd understood, at some level, exactly how serious this was the whole time, and had chosen silence anyway, for 2 straight years, rather than risk the relationship he was simultaneously trying to build with me. I ended the engagement that week. I gave the ring back, packed up the handful of things I'd started keeping at his place in anticipation of moving in together, and blocked his number after one final, difficult conversation where he apologized, genuinely, I think, but in the specific way people apologize once consequences have already arrived rather than before they became necessary. The first few nights after that final conversation, I stayed at Holly's place, unable to face my own apartment, which still had a handful of Adam's things scattered through it from the months we'd spent slowly, unknowingly, merging our lives in preparation for a future that had never actually been available to build. Holly didn't ask me to talk if I didn't want to, just let me sit on her couch in silence some evenings, and pushed gently on others, when she could tell I needed to actually say the things circling in my head out loud, rather than let them sit there festering. Telling my parents was harder than I expected it to be, not because they were unsupportive, they were, immediately and completely, but because I found myself, more than once during that conversation, instinctively trying to soften the story, to make Adam sound less deceptive than he'd actually been. Some old reflex kicking in that made me want to protect him even in the moment I was describing exactly how thoroughly he'd betrayed my trust. My mother noticed it too, gently pointing out, at one point, that I kept using the word technically to describe things that weren't technical at all. They were just lies, plainly stated, and hearing her name that pattern out loud helped me stop doing it. I found out, through a mutual friend a few months later, that Adam and Vivian did finally file for divorce, prompted, apparently, by the fallout of my discovering everything. Though I take no particular satisfaction in that outcome, since it mostly just confirms that the two of them were capable of untangling that arrangement whenever they actually wanted to, and simply hadn't wanted to badly enough until it blew up someone else's life to force the issue. Holly was the one who talked me through the hardest part of the aftermath, the weeks where I found myself questioning not just Adam, but my own judgment, replaying 2 years of memories and wondering how I'd missed something that, looking back, felt like it should have been obvious. "You didn't miss it," she told me one night, sitting on my couch with a carton of ice cream between us. "You noticed almost all of it. You just gave him the benefit of the doubt, over and over, because that's what a reasonable, trusting person does in a healthy relationship. The problem was never your judgment. It was that he kept lying well enough to make your judgment look wrong." That reframing helped more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that stretch, because it let me hold onto the version of myself that had noticed things, rather than the version that felt foolish for having missed them. I also had a strange, unexpectedly clarifying conversation with Vivian herself, about 6 weeks after everything came out, when she called me out of nowhere, asking to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but curiosity, and maybe some leftover need for closure, won out. She apologized, in her own way, for the years of quiet territorial behavior, admitted that some part of her had always resented how easily I'd fit into Adam's life in ways she'd apparently spent years trying to prevent anyone else from doing. It wasn't a warm conversation, and I don't think we parted as anything resembling friends, but it did confirm something I'd already suspected, that whatever had originally been practical about their marriage had, at some point along the way, become something Vivian, at least, had started actively working to protect. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday afternoon at the kitchen counter. I've thought a lot in that time about all the small moments I explained away over those 2 years, the shared anniversary dinners, Vivian's mother's slip of the tongue, the careful, matching financial categories in an app meant for splitting utility bills. I don't think I was foolish for giving Adam the benefit of the doubt on any single one of those moments in isolation. I think what I've learned, the harder way, is that patterns matter more than any individual data point, and that when someone keeps handing you small, reasonable-sounding explanations for a whole collection of things that don't quite add up, the actual truth is usually sitting somewhere underneath all those individual explanations, waiting, the way mine was, for one piece of paper honest enough to say the word nobody else in the room was willing to say out loud.